Good evening. Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Pat Zerke, the director of the Forum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this program as we host historian Colin Gordon in conversation with Michael Widmer, former president of the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation, discussing economic inequality.
I'm Michael Widmer. For the past 25 years, I've been at the center of economic, fiscal, and tax policy discussions in Massachusetts, and I will be your moderator. Our speaker, Colin Gordon, is currently a professor of history at the University of Iowa. His research focuses on political economy and public policy in the United States since 1920.
When we talk about inequality, we're talking really about nothing less than the basic structure and history of modern society, about the way in which markets distribute rewards and resources, the way in which public policies might compensate for the failures of the market, and the way in which both those markets and the policies shape the experiences and the prospects of individuals and of families. So, to attempt in a few short minutes a summary account of American inequality is a perilous and maybe even silly undertaking. But I'm going to try anyway. I think to offer such a summary account, I would start with three observations around which I'll organize my remarks. And the first of these is that American inequality, contemporary American inequality, is exceptional. That is, by any measure, we are more unequal now than we have ever been, and we are more unequal by a long shot than most of our peers among developed and democratic nations. My second observation is that American inequality is political. It's not, in other words, some unhappy consequence of market forces. It's a direct and tangible result of public policies, or the failure of public policies, whose very design and intent has been to distribute income and wealth upwards. And my third observation is that American inequality is consequential. That is, obviously it hurts those that it leaves behind, but it also, as I will argue, does great damage to our more general economic and democratic prospects. So let's start with the first of those observations, the exceptionalism of American inequality. We conventionally study or measure inequality in three different ways. And the first of these is wages or compensation. And if we look at real wages, that is adjusted for inflation across the last generation, they've stagnated, basically flatlined. Now, in the first generation after the Second World War, wages grew alongside the economy. And the real median wage for production workers doubled between 1947 and 1979. Since 1979, the economy has grown at roughly the same pace, but that median wage has actually fallen. The current inequality of labor income in the United States is, as Thomas Piketty concludes, probably higher than in any other society at any time in the past, anywhere in the world. The second measure, and the more conventional one for inequality, is income. Income is in many respects a better measure of how we are doing because it does a couple of things. It counts other forms of compensation, like returns on investment, and it groups wage earners into family or household units. And here, the inequality trajectory is even starker. As with wages, incomes basically doubled for all households between 1947 and 1979. Since 1979, since that point, the income of the poorest 20%, the bottom quintile of income earners, has fallen by 12%. While the income of the richest 1% has risen by 185%. The third measure then is wealth. So wealth, in a sense, is accumulated income, but takes into account savings and home equity and the like. And there, the inequity is starker still. The richest 1% in the United States in 2014 claim about 1/3 of all net worth, and the richest 10% claim over 2/3. Now, on all of these measures, we're an outlier among nations. The top 1% of Americans, for example, claimed about 8% of national income in 1980, a share which was very much in line with income distribution among our peer nations. By 2010, that had swollen more than doubled to over 18%, a rate that was double most of our peer nations. And the top 1% share of wealth is also double what we see across other democratic and industrialized settings. So all of this brings me to my second major observation, which is the political nature of American inequality. Indeed, I think the only way to explain these jaw-dropping gaps between rich and poor, between the US and its peers, between our current circumstances and our own history, is to examine the politics and the institutions that are at the root of American exceptionalism. This is a key point, and I think it's often overlooked in our eagerness to just measure the damage, to just document inequality's dimensions and consequences. And I think it's a point that's often missed when we focus on the big, sweeping changes that are changing our world, things like technological change, globalization, demographic change, the economic recession and recovery, the movement of business cycles. Because as explanations for growing inequality, these are all really woefully inadequate and incomplete. They capture some of the circumstances, some of the economic pressures that we face, but they cannot account for either the timing of American inequality or the stark differences in timing and in degree between the United States and everybody else. These forces, in other words, are faced by citizens of industrial nations across the world, and many of those nations do not face the same sort of inequality problem that we do. I think a better and a fuller explanation for where we are and how we got there starts to come into focus if we consider the political and economic conditions that prevailed in this country right after the Second World War. At that historical moment, the United States displayed much narrower gaps between the rich and the poor than we do now. The gains of economic growth were much more broadly distributed, and working families, at least white working families, enjoyed much greater economic security. And the source of that shared prosperity can be found, I think, in the political struggle and in the policy choices that came in response to the Great Depression and the challenge of the Second World War. So federal support for collective bargaining rights sustained a surge in labor organization that dramatically improved the bargaining power of American workers. Other political innovations of the New Deal, ranging from Social Security to the minimum wage, built sort of a floor for working class incomes. Post-war social movements, especially civil rights and second-wave feminism, girded that floor by closing off avenues for discrimination. And a more robust and progressive tax system, coupled with new regulatory obstacles to speculative finance, erected something of a ceiling for higher incomes. Well, over the last generation, to put it bluntly, we've burned that house down. And I think there are 5 sort of key political and policy developments that fueled that fire. The first of these is the precipitous collapse in private sector union membership, from over 1/3 of the workforce in the early 1950s to 6% today. The arc of union membership, which rose in the 1930s and 1940s to that third and has fallen off ever since, is in fact a sort of eerie mirror image of the income share of the top 10%. Declining union strength destroyed bargaining power. It drew down wages, especially male wages. And the impact of those losses are exaggerated in the United States, a setting where workers have historically also relied on collective bargaining for basics like health insurance and pensions. The second policy development is a parallel collapse in basic labor standards and what we might characterize as safety net policies. Our minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, is worth far less now than it was in the late 1960s. And measured as a share of the median wage or of the average wage, it falls far near the bottom of labor standards if we compare the United States to its peers. This erosion of job quality and security is also marked by a rise in temporary or contingent employment relationships, which has further eroded working class security and incomes. And on balance, the reach and the adequacy of the policies that we rely upon to pick up the pieces, things like family assistance and unemployment insurance, disability benefits, are weaker than those of our peers, and they're weaker than they used to be. Simply put, market inequalities, that is, uneven rewards from work, are steeper here than they are among most of our peers in most other settings. And we do less about this, less to redistribute those incomes, than any of those peers. The third policy development that I'd identify in this respect is the virtual disappearance of market or regulatory restraint on incomes at the top. So in a sense, when we're talking about inequality in the American setting, we're talking about the collapse of that floor, but also the collapse of any restraint on top incomes that allows the gap to grow from both ends. In part, this is a consequence at the top end of the growth of finance as a share of the economy, particularly speculative finance, and the dizzying incomes, of the hedge fund managers and the like that accompany it. And in part, it marks a collapse in corporate governance, which has allowed executive salaries, executive compensation, irrespective of firm performance, of how the business does, to balloon from about 25 times the wages of the average worker to about 300 times today. Both trends, that is, financialization and the spike in executive compensation, are political in origin. They've occurred in the space afforded by the deregulation of banking and securities. Fourth, among these policy developments, we've also seen a fundamental shift in what's commonly called macroeconomic policy. That is the management of the money supply and spending at the national level. What we've seen in this shift is a move towards a set of macroeconomic policies which consistently choose controlling inflation over pursuing full employment. Now, the preoccupation with inflation serves first and foremost financial interests, for whom inflation is always a particular and overriding concern. And by accepting higher levels of unemployment, policymakers have, over the last generation, effectively dampened inflation by dampening wage growth, either through sustained joblessness, that is, spikes of unemployment, or through a wider range of policies, including deregulation, the liberalization of trade, attacks on collective bargaining, cuts to social programs, which taken together serve to erode the bargaining power of workers. And then the fifth and final of these policy developments is, I think, the transformation of the tax system, the importance of which has three important components. First, we've fundamentally shifted the tax burden onto the backs of ordinary Americans by slashing rates on high incomes. So the top marginal rate has gone from 90% in the 1950s to 38% today, by paring back corporate tax rates, and by backfilling federal revenues with middle-class income taxes and payroll taxes. The results, I think, are unambiguous. There's a direct and compelling relationship between the rate at which advanced economies have slashed taxes on high earners and the rate at which inequality in those settings has grown, with the United States leading the pack. And thirdly, this is not just a question of redistribution, not just a windfall for the rich. It brings with it a reshaping of incentives and bargaining power and social norms across the economy. And it means that the public sector, as a result of the changes in the tax system, is starved of the resources that it might need to solve problems or to mop up after market failures, runaway inequality being foremost among those. And this brings me to my final observation. That is that these policy choices taken together have real and sustained consequences. In one respect, these consequences are social. As a generation of research has documented, social outcomes, physical and mental health, household formation or breakdown, substance abuse, educational access and achievement, imprisonment, violence, intergenerational mobility, trust and community cohesion, all of these are significantly worse in settings where inequality is high. The consequences are also economic. Inequality clearly matters to those that it leaves behind. That's a simple point. Some, of course, would see this as a good or at least an inevitable thing in the sense that differential outcomes create the incentive for people to work hard, or that they simply reflect differences in ability or effort. But in fact, current research is showing quite the opposite. That because inequality undermines economic mobility and opportunity, it actually produces a starkly inefficient allocation of resources. The market works less well. And for these reasons, I think inequality also matters more generally to the public welfare and to the health of the economy for everyone. Even the International Monetary Fund has conceded on this point, concluding recently, quote, that lower net inequality is robustly correlated with faster and more durable growth. And these consequences are political. Inequality tips the playing field towards those with the resources to shape political outcomes. It tilts our attention and resources away from collective goods, good schools, infrastructure that are essential to future growth and prosperity. It undermines our very faith in democratic institutions in such a way that growing inequality itself, rather than leaping to the fore of the political agenda, actually erodes our willingness or ability to do anything about it. And it reinforces and replicates itself. That is, the disproportionate political clout of the well-off leads to policies and policy priorities that deepen and sustain inequality, and then deepen and sustain that political influence. The punchline then is this: inequality is stark, and it's getting starker. And the deleterious effects across our society, our economy, and our democracy are profound. But there is a glimmer of light, because this is not something that just happened to us. It's not some storm front of market forces that washed over us. Inequality is policy, and what we've done can be undone. Thank you.
As moderator, I've been asked to make a brief response. And I should say first, every one of Colin's points could be the subject of discussion tonight and well into the night. And he's covered a broad arena. And I think the number one point that I want to make, and then I'll come at it slightly differently, is that I agree that this is an exceptional and deeply troubling development, this growth, dramatic growth of economic inequality. As Colin has said, it has serious consequences, obviously, for individuals and for our society. And our democracy, I'm a political scientist by training, and so I think about the political implications and political aspects of these things, these trends. But our democracy is built on a sense of shared commitment and shared promise and shared sacrifice. And this enormous growth in economic inequality threatens to fracture all of that. Let me take a slightly different approach, but agreeing with Colin and the context that he has presented. And that is, let me talk about the middle class. As we think about this problem, the wealthy consuming more and more of the income and the wages and the wealth, and then at the lower end, a smaller and smaller proportion. I don't want us to lose sight of the fact of the middle class, because that, I think, is critical to understanding where we are today and to the question of what do we do. As I look back at the era coming out of World War II until the late 1970s, you had, in essence, America had something close to, and I'm exaggerating slightly, but something close to a global economic monopoly. We certainly dominated the global scene economically. And in that context, people in regular jobs, the middle class, were able to make a very good income and get wage increases and so forth that were commensurate with what were happening in the economy. And as a result, they were part of the American dream, if you will, the land of opportunity, and that was spread, the wealth was spread broadly. That was important, of course, economically and for those individuals and families, but it was also important politically, because it's my belief that the growth of the middle class in that era was the political backdrop and context that allowed and I'm talking generally speaking here about the federal government, that allowed the federal government to undertake the kind of initiatives that we're all aware of, the civil rights and the war on poverty and so forth. Those initiatives in which government in that era saw itself having a responsibility to help individuals and to broaden the opportunities in our society. But since 1980, roughly, we've seen a decline, as we've seen this growing economic inequality, we've seen a decline in the middle class. That's obviously widely commented upon, the erosion of the middle class. Now, yes, some policies have contributed to that. I agree with Colin, but I do think that there are two major forces that have contributed mightily as well. One is globalization. I think when you move from America as the dominant economic force to one in which you're seeing many other countries competing, and that's obviously reached a point in which previously developing or undeveloped countries are now challenging us around the globe. That's clearly been a threat, more than a threat, has cost middle-class jobs here. But the other is technology, technological advances. I mean, I worked for a period in the 1980s at a Cabot Corporation, a chemical and energy company. And you might have in a carbon black plant, you might have 100 employees on the floor producing this carbon black, which is a reinforcing agent in rubber, goes into all tires. Very mature industry, but you might have 100 people on the floor who had jobs, and good jobs, getting good wages. Today, I don't know the exact number, but it's probably no more than 10. And this relentless technological advances and changes have chewed up jobs of middle-class Americans. And that obviously won't change. And so one of the issues that we have to deal with, I think, here, and is not simply subject to policy changes, though that's obviously one of the areas, is what do we do about the fact that we've lost these middle-class, middle-income jobs? And it's particularly, and it's perverse here, and I agree with Colin was making slightly differently, but the same observation, I think. It's perverse because we've seen the erosion of the middle class. I think we've lost the consensus that they provided, the political consensus, to address the kind of problems that we're discussing tonight. Ironically, it's because of the decline of the middle class and the erosion of the notion of the American dream and the land of opportunity in which the next generation will be better than the previous and so forth, because that reality has changed dramatically. That has, ironically, as I say, undercut the political consensus to address this very problem. So that is a huge, it's an economic issue and it's a political issue. And it's further complicated by the fact that we've seen over the last 35 years, really, a change, a dramatic change, and I'm making a political comment here, in how government sees its role. So that, and I mean, this is not obviously true with everybody, but in terms of the consensus that we had in Washington up through much of the 50 years after, or 40 years after the end of World War II, in which both Republican and Democratic parties were focusing on, well, how do we improve society, broadly defined, and obviously huge differences and great fights within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party, between the parties, and about what's the right way to do that around any particular policy issue. But government was seen as a source of, not final answer for everything, but at least a source of a positive force to try to improve the lives and the quality of life of our citizens. That consensus obviously has fractured. And that is a huge change. I mean, that's a sea change in our political establishment, in our political debates, so that we're seeing so much of the debate today around, well, essentially that government should get out of the way. So from a political point of view, if government's getting out of the way, you're not even able to get into a debate about addressing the right way or the wrong way to deal with these kinds of issues that we're talking tonight, the growth of this, in America, of economic inequality. So those comments simply piggyback off of what Colin is saying and give a slightly different and perhaps a more political look at where we are today. But I'm totally in agreement that this development, which has gained steam very rapidly if one thinks about it, I mean, we're talking about 1980 when it began, this development and its gained steam has serious consequences for the future of this country and our democratic society. With that, we'll start a discussion, and I was going to ask Colin two things, and I'll sit down with him. One is if he had any reaction to my remarks, and secondly, if he might cite 2 or 3 policies, politics aside, but if we were able to achieve some policy changes, what would be at the top of your Colin's lists? Thank you.
Well, I think for starters, I would go back to your observation about the pressures of technological change and of globalization, because on the one hand, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it creates a competitive economic environment in which the pressure not only on wages and job conditions, but also on what governments can do, has changed fundamentally. But I think it's important to recognize that these are pressures faced by all industrial democracies, and that not all industrial and democratic democracies see the same trajectory of inequality as the United States does. And in fact, many of the pressures that you describe, particularly of sort of technological change and particularly of globalization, occurred across the economy prior to the spike in inequality, which comes, I would argue, more from political forces after 1979. So that one of the implications of that, I think, is that I don't think that what we're seeing is a redistribution of those old middle-class, high-wage jobs to other sectors of the economy, to low-wage service or to high tech. I think what is really driving particularly wage inequality is that wages are falling within those occupations. So if you look at the arc of, say, wages in meatpacking, they go up to the 1980s and have fallen 30% since then. And that, meatpacking is not an industry which is really subject to global pressures in the ways that many others. It's more subject to local production. And there, the pressure on wages is largely the collapse of bargaining power, the collapse of organized labor within the meatpacking industry. So, in a very roundabout way to get to your provocative question about what I would do first, I think I would start at the point at which wages are paid and do what you can to raise the bargaining power of working Americans of modest educational attainment. That's what the labor movement did through its heyday into the 1970s. But that's what other policies, high labor standards, a high minimum wage, much more uniform application of overtime rules and similar labor standards, and a serious enforcement of those labor standards, which were also lacking. And I think if you start by building that floor, not only through the sort of regulatory thresholds like the minimum wage, but just by giving working Americans and their families the opportunity and the bargaining power to bid up their own wages, that you would address a tremendous amount of the damage that's been done.
Hi. I'm Ann Withorn, Emeritus Professor from UMass Boston in Social Policy. What both of you said is really nice. The problem with it is it's the same nice criticism that lots of folks have been making for a while, and it hasn't helped us to move on. It's not your fault. It's Piketty's fault. It's Elizabeth Warren. I want to throttle her when she talks about the middle class, getting back to the middle class. I want you to tell me what the middle class ever was, except certain parts of the people who benefited from the labor movement, which is workers, which is the proletariat, which is working class. And the fact that some parts of the working class got enough money to call themselves middle class, and then we all thought that was better, it just doesn't help us to get to the next stage. We'll never get to that. We have to get to owning ourselves up as workers are getting screwed by capitalism. I'm not some kind of insistent on socialism, I'm just saying that was the reality. When you talk about it as if we can get back to something that was always kind of an illusion, or at least very specific. So I just would ask you to both to comment on it. The other thing is that you really have to talk more, and there's a lot of research now done by amazing people about the fact that there was systematic theft from African American people for the entire time. The money that was not going to African American people based on the origins of slavery, based on continued discrimination, continued pushing everything down, has been an incredible drain on what we would call the middle class, which was to the degree to which existed all of us white people. And I think we have to talk about that as white people, as middle class people, whatever, as professionals. We have to say that part of that was purely theft from African American people, and it won't get back. I want you to comment on this, but it won't come back unless we change that dynamic. And the third thing is a real question, which is, these are comments that I want you to comment back. The real question is, what do you think about the possibility of a basic income policy as opposed to a raising wages policy or a wage policy? Not in opposition to, but there's a lot of folks now around the globe who are saying that the problem is lack of money. Let's create a way of sharing the resources to get money to everybody and then work from there, because we're never going to get it up by just trying to increase wages. And there's a lot of stuff on that. You know about it better than I do. Okay.
Colin, do you want to
Well,
begin?
I'll pitch in by taking your second comment about African American inequality, because it is an area of current research for me. We've seen in the last generation wage inequality between white and black Americans narrow a little bit to about 75%. And we've seen income inequality narrow to about 2/3. Wealth inequality since the Great Recession has actually gotten wider. And at the median, African Americans' wealth is about 10% of what white Americans can claim. It's not really about slavery. It's about, because wealth for most people in the middle of the income spectrum is really about housing. And it's the fact that white families got on an escalator of wealth creation in the 1930s and 1940s when the federal government reinvented the home mortgage industry, at a time when there was systematic real estate discrimination in American cities that was incorporated, in fact, into the federal residential security ratings, into the system of mortgage finance, and into the system of zoning and suburbanization, which followed. So I couldn't agree more. My comments here were designed to sort of broadly sketch patterns of wage and income inequality, but the inequality based upon group characteristics, racial inequality is fundamental. There's also gender inequality. There are stark regional patterns of inequality based on where you're more or less likely to be mobile, and these are fundamental as well.
I might make a comment on really the first observation. There's no way that we can return to the era of 1945 to 1980 in terms of the growth of the middle class, which, as I think she correctly said, was the working class, but then got enough money and moved into the middle class. My point was that looking at that period of history, I think it was obviously important economically, and then as well politically, because I think it gave, as I said, was the glue, if you will, or the drive that allowed us to do a lot of the initiatives that helped all of society. But that era is gone, and with it, a lot of those middle-income jobs. And in other sectors, we're seeing these jobs disappear. I don't have an answer, and I read a lot of economists, and they don't really, generally speaking, have an answer about, all right, with the technological advances in most industries, and then the disappearance of those jobs, where are we going to have the jobs for the great larger number of people? You'll always have the very advanced high-level jobs with advanced degrees and so forth. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think I lay that out simply because I think that's part of the context in which we have to think about how do we steer through this maze and these problems. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm somewhat surprised that you made no reference to the Supreme Court's decision on Citizens United 5 years ago, which basically gives corporations the right to contribute as much as they want to any political candidate and without disclosing how much they've given. Do you think that's a factor or not?
You want to start? No.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I certainly think Citizens, which followed on the earlier Buckley decision, basically holding that money was a form of speech, certainly have an important influence. It's always been true of the American political system has been exceptional in the respect that it lacks any system of public finance, serious system of public financing of elections. It relies on private money in ways that are fundamentally different than electoral system elsewhere in the world. It also relies on a system of perpetual campaigning, which is very unlike parliamentary systems. But I think it's also important to recognize that I think we would face roughly the same pantheon of problems without Citizens United. Because I think fundamentally the background inequality that I described creates a set of political dynamics in which the very well-off are able to shape political priorities, not just at campaign and election time, but consistently across legislative sessions. The new political science research on this is really quite clear that the actual sort of priorities of legislatures are fundamentally shaped by the disproportionate voice of the well-off. And it's not, it's compounded, I think, by their ability to flood campaigns with cash, but it's not at root caused by that. I think the root cause is the inequality itself.
I would just add that Citizens United, I think, obviously from a political point of view, is another barrier to try to address these issues in a reasonable and coherent way. Yes, sir.
Hi, Kevin Block-Schwenk, professor of economics at Berklee College of Music. And thanks for what you've given. I've done a lot of research myself in inequality. And just a sort of political point I'd like y'all to comment on. Whenever I look at the, let's say, unraveling of the great American consensus, as you put it, I can't help notice that inequality was taking off as the Cold War was winding down. That to what extent did our, low inequality, was that a function of sort of keeping Americans united on a war setting, and as the outside threat disappeared, we headed back toward a different political equilibrium? Thank you.
Yes.
Well, it's an interesting point. I'm not sure that it's more than a coincidence in timing, however. At best, military spending at the sort of peak of the Cold War in the late 1960s would probably accounted for about 10% of gross national product. It's part of what we lost. It's certainly in that sort of set of changes that came at the end of the 1970s. It's also true that perpetual war in the Middle East since then hasn't helped us much. So I'm not sure that we're in a position where either in terms of political consensus or in terms of the ability of the federal government in a fiscal sense to push money into the economy and sustain growth in much the same way that as it happened during the Cold War is really operative anymore today.
I agree with Colin's comments. I think economically, the economic point, but it's intriguing. I hadn't thought about this. I think it's a very intriguing question. I grew up in that era, and the Cold War was a unifying force, in fact. So it may be a bit of a coincidence in largely that, but when one thinks of the fracturing of this broad consensus that I've described, I think it's interesting. I had never thought of it before, but I think the Cold War was part of all of that. And so it may have been a coincidence, but I think clearly what we've seen since the dissipation of the Soviet Union is, smaller and vastly more divisive wars than we didn't have a Cold War other than in theory, but it was, I think, as I say, a kind of unifying force against one enemy. Yes, sir, next question.
Hi, I'm Dave Buck. I live in Cambridge, and I have a question for Mr. Widmer, and that is 2 or 3 weekends ago, Jim Brodey wrote an article in the Globe suggesting that Governor Baker be sort of like Richard Nixon when he went to China, only in this case, support a graduated income tax. Now, whether or not Charlie Baker would ever do that, my question is, do you think there are better circumstances now to raise the question of a graduated state income tax in Massachusetts at this point? And in addition to that, do you see any promising areas of taxation that might help us to increase equity and also get more money to the state?
Sure. On the graduated income tax, we have a single rate, of course, in Massachusetts, But at the lower end, below $50,000, the tax is very graduated. And that's because we have rental deductions, earned income tax credit, and so forth. When I was on the end, it would take a constitutional amendment to institute a graduated income tax in which you could have a different rate. The Constitution prohibits that now, so the graduation comes from things like the earned income tax credit and so forth, and then standard exemptions. I was on this commission that looked at this issue a year ago, and my focus was on, because I think it's problematic that a constitutional amendment would pass, can't be on the ballot until 2018. It's a 4-year effort, it has to go through 2 legislative sessions. And my focus had been on increasing the exemptions and so forth at the lower end of the economic scale. And we did, in fact, have unity of on a couple of those recommendations. Ironically, perhaps, and given, as you say, in terms of Republican governor, he's put out a proposal, which I think is very sound, and that is to eliminate the film tax credit, which basically is just a subsidy for actors of California or where else, and producers from out of state. Does very little, dramatically little for the economy of Massachusetts, and to take those proceeds to increase the earned income tax credit. And we've been, when I was at the foundation, strongly opposed to the film tax credit for years because it was a boondoggle, and supportive of increasing the earned income tax credit. So I don't know whether the Democratic legislature will go along with the Republican governor on that, but it's a very sound proposal. Ultimately, I think when one looks at the intersection of raising additional revenues and the question of progressivity, one has to do it in say, all right, raise the overall rate if you need no revenues, raise the overall rate of the income tax, but then increase the exemptions, deductions, and so forth at the lower end, so that what you do is, in fact, put most of the burden on the middle and higher income taxpayers because the rate goes up and the value of the exemptions is much more at the lower end. So that would be the strategy, I think, that would be more realistic and than trying to change the Constitution.
Rosalie Anders from Cambridge. You talk about 1979 and 1980. I remember that time. And one thing that happened, of course, was that Ronald Reagan got elected president. And one of the things I remember vividly about that was how strongly our national narrative shifted with him. You know, suddenly government was bad, government was the problem. There was a lot of sort of not that hidden racism in the rhetoric that went on there that I think we wouldn't have seen before then. You know, things like welfare queens and so forth. There was a systematic dismantling of the war on poverty, et cetera. Suddenly, the idea that I think had really kind of been out there somewhat was that we were our brother's keepers, I feel like really disappeared. And I just wondered what your thought is about that and about whether this is a real shift in values, and if it is, how much of our thinking about changing it should be about us trying to reshift our values again.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, certainly, and this goes back to my background point about the sort of shifting social norms that come with inequality, the way in which we talk about things differently. And I think a good example of that is taxes. I mean, Reagan, on that score, came very much out of the sort of Prop 13 property tax movement, cap movement in California, the notion that, you know, that any tax feeding the government beast was a bad idea, and that by, you know, as people put it at the time, starving the beast was a way of solving the growth of government. And it's important to recognize, I think, that prior to that point, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was often a very sort of strong ethic that taxes were an investment in the collective good, that you would have local and statewide campaigns which were quite successful in saying, we need to raise taxes by this much because we need better schools or we need to fix our roads. And I think that you're exactly right, that in many ways that the sort of baseline of that conversation has shifted in fundamental ways. And it's much harder now to begin a conversation about the benefits of affirmative state action given the background assumptions that government, sort of messes up everything it touches and the tax money is all wasted and that sort of thing.
I agree. The question really summarized a lot of what I was saying in my comments, and I agree almost with everything that Colin has just said. I might, add a couple of things. I think look, citizens have never liked taxes. I mean, that's the history of the world probably, but certainly America. I mean, that's a given. But I think there's an understanding, as Colin said, that taxes were, you want investments, whether it's highways, education, healthcare, and public safety and so forth, and every broad agreement that those are necessities in some level. And so you need taxes to pay for those. And there's been a breakdown in the connection between taxes and services. So in my tenure at the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, I mean, we've taken different positions on taxes over the years. I mean, we're arguing strenuously for a much larger increase in the gas tax than actually happened, and because we've got this huge shortfall in funding for transportation in the state for years, and now obviously it came to light in its glorious fashion with the MBTA recently, but we've done at the foundation several studies highlighting the shortfall. So present the need for additional revenues to address investments in transportation, public and roads. And I can't tell you the number of comments I've had from citizens and others. The business community, I might add, is usually more understanding of that than many of the citizens, at least in this state. Probably not maybe in the rest of the country, but certainly in this state. But the comments of people saying, well, there's a lot of waste in the system. There's waste. So, once we find all the waste, then we'll think about revenues. Of course, we never get to that point. But that's at all level of government. Now, obviously, there is some waste, and one of the things we did at the foundation was to try to highlight that so you could save money to invest in the things that we all believe need investments. But the point of all of that is just the breakdown, and between those two, and a key element of that is the distrust in government that really began, I think, in 1980, the notion that government itself was bad. Not that government was ever perfect and the debate is, okay, what is the proper role of government? And is government really the right way to fix this problem? Or what kind of partnerships, and so on and so forth. But then government now is the problem. I tell a personal anecdote. We had a retirement party for me 3 weeks ago, a very nice one, and I was commenting on just this point that I came out of the John Kennedy era, and that really has been motivated my whole career, which is public service in all forms, and obviously public service today is often ridiculed. And that's part of the breakdown of this consensus we had, broadly defined, that there was, that we at least, we were charitable about trying to help those in need. So that's a long answer.
I mean, I would also add that, what made the sort of political revolution of the late 70s, early 1980s possible was that our system of public finance was fragile to begin with, because there was such a weak commitment to general benefits from general resources. The United States has, more so than any other setting, showed a genius for basically submerging tax-funded benefits disguising them as if they were private accomplishments. My favorite example of this is the emblematic sign at the Tea Party rally, which is "Get the government's hands off my Medicare." And it's not silly, because when the program based on Social Security was when that form of sort of contributory social insurance was invented, in fact Roosevelt specifically made the case that they'll never be able to cut this program because people will think that they're getting their money back out of it. They won't see it as a government program. Other examples would include the fact that because of the exclusively local reliance on to finance schools in the United States, people generally assume that their kids are in a good school because they bought a good house. And that's a private accomplishment. And it's also true, I think, in terms of this sort of, what this political science Suzanne Mettler has called the submerged state, is the most fundamental government expenditure as a tax expenditure in the federal code is the home mortgage deduction. And people will say, I get nothing from the government, when in fact, they get more than the people they're complaining about in spades.
I think I might add one thing. I think what Colin just said is a very important point. If you look at the history of this country, and clearly the whole notion of individualism is central to that. And part of all of that is the notion that if you work hard, you will succeed. I mean, that goes back to the origins of America. And the downside of that, well, we're seeing the result of that in what Colin was saying in terms of the sort of the disguised means by which we have passed critical social programs. There isn't the kind of, there was, I argued briefly, I think in the decades after World War II, but there hasn't been over the history of our country the kind of consensus around social supports that there are in a lot of the other societies that don't have, as Colin was saying, the great gaps in growing inequality. So I think our history is not our friend.
And part of that, just to add one more piece, which goes back to the earlier comment, is race. Is the fact that, at the time Social Security was invented, it had to be segregated and given to the southern states to administer because it would not pass Congress otherwise. And so we ended up with a welfare state that was very fragmented, very regionally uneven. And really, the sort of Reaganite consensus about welfare is really rooted in the way in which general social benefits were viewed in the Jim Crow South at the origins of the program.
Yes, ma'am, the next question.
Okay, so I have so many different places I could go here, but I guess I'm going to pick, so I'm someone that cares a lot about people, but I also care very deeply about the environment and the global health of our planet. They go together, and I think it goes to trade and globalization and the driving down of, wages everywhere and all this explosion of cheap stuff to buy and our desire to have everything be cheap and buy a lot. So, I think the fault goes back to some of the trade agreements and not having labor standards and environmental standards be sort of part of those so that you could get away from people ruining their environment to provide us with cheap stuff, and then us not having jobs anymore because, back in the 80s, I think LL Bean, practically everything they sold was made in the United States, and now hardly anything in one of their catalogs is from this country. So I'm just wondering, how can we fix that? Is there any hope for being able to interject some sanity into, I just think the way things are now just benefits these big corporations and not really people. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Colin?
Well, I think you're exactly right. I don't view globalization as a sort of unrelenting a market force that has this immutable logic. And in fact, there are, most of the countries in Western Europe have much more export-import penetration than the United States does, and they don't have anywhere near the inequality dimension we have. And they have been able to sustain in different ways local or national rules that govern the terms of trade. So globalization and the ease with which goods and services can cross national borders is one thing. That's a market force. It's driven by technological change, just our sheer ability to move stuff around. But the terms of trade are political, and they always have been. And there's nothing that requires that those terms of trade be a race to the bottom. It's more difficult to make it a race to the top, but the least we could do is race to the middle. I think of the way in which, for example, our national commitments to trade agreements beginning in the 1970s and 1980s actually trumped or preempted any ability to control the terms of trade locally. I think Massachusetts was a state that ran into that with an effort to establish some sort of, local buying, for example, or made in the U.S. Rules. This was in the late 1980s, and we're told, it violates the WTO. You can't do that. Those are political decisions. Those are not market forces. Well, I would hope so. It's certainly, it's more cheerful to hope so than it is to hope not, or to think not. I think one of the things that you identify as well in this thirst for cheap goods points to a sort of long-term transformation in our economy from a sort of producer goods to a consumer goods economy, and the highest value becomes creating the cheapest good. And we often see this, in fact, in the defense by, unnamed big box retailers who say that we're actually helping poor people by providing very cheap goods. And there's a degree of truth in that, but there are other ways. You could just as easily do it by raising their wages and make it possible for people to avoid better goods or goods that are locally produced. And I see these as, again, as political decisions rather than market forces.
I might just add a broad political comment to give a little hope. And that is the thing that struck me over my lifetime in studying politics and being in politics is the swing of the pendulum. Now, it doesn't undo economic forces, so we suddenly don't have to worry about economic inequality. I'm not saying that at all. But in terms of galvanizing, action being galvanized, because situations reach a point where there is a critical mass of individuals and groups that say we need to act. And I think that has been one of the positive things of American democracy. And I think the pendulum politically here, broadly around issues that we're talking inequality tonight, has swung a long way, and we'll see, but whether there are enough political forces generated that can move the politics back to deal with this problem and other kinds of problems in ways that we're not addressing at this point. So.
I think one positive development, and you see it in the sort of Fight for 15 and the fast food strikes, picks up on this sort of American value that Michael identified, that is, if you work hard, you should be able to support your family. And I think there is a broad consensus around that, and it's reflected in relatively bipartisan support for the EITC, both federally and at the state level. I think it's much harder, I think, to marshal a political argument against paying retail and fast food workers more so that they can, because they're workers, than it was in the past, say, to marshal the argument against redistributing income to those who weren't working. And, in some respects, the rhetoric of the Reagan Revolution, which so heavily played on those leeching off the state and taxpayers, actually facilitated a discussion in which I think it makes it easier to argue that we should have policies in place that sustain the incomes of those who work for a living.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Matthew Page Lieberman, and I live in Medford. So I just wanted to start by thanking a couple of the speakers who were here previously, right here, talking about the interplay of race and poverty. I mean, obviously we know that there was an immense amount of wealth that was built up in this country through this enslavement of people for a few centuries. And but there's a part that I'm not quite sure about. There's a race scholar named Tim Wise, and he talked about how social services were mostly the idea was to provide them for women of men who were off in the war so they would not have to fall into poverty. And that by the time Reagan arrived, the idea was, I mean, one of the best ways, my understanding is that how people have been able to fight against movements to address poverty is by racializing it. And my understanding is that Reagan, all of this played into his caricature of the pathologizing about black people, these lazy black welfare queens. And he made it easier to chip away at the social safety net by playing off racial fears. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm really glad that race has been involved in this discussion today. The past, really recently, it came out that our ex-governor, Deval Patrick, was getting paid $7,500 a day to lobby on behalf of the Olympics coming to Boston. Now, the mayor criticized him, and Elizabeth Warren she took a jab at him at this St. Patrick's Day discussion, and after that, he said he would not take any more money. He would be doing it as a volunteer. Now, the other day, though, it also came out that he's a lobbyist for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So some people make the argument that, people should be able to make as much money as they want to. I'm not particularly sympathetic to that. I have some concerns about politicians just transitioning back and forth as lobbyists. But this past election, we had these three candidates in the Democratic field. One of them was Don Berwick, who really called the government to task for not addressing poverty. And he talked about the plans that have worked to eradicate homelessness around the country. And he said that there are all these plans in place, and it was really a shame that the government of Massachusetts didn't do anything. When the question got to Martha Coakley, what she said about poverty was, we can address that when the economy gets better, which I think is the worst time, to address homelessness is when, So my question is, although we know about what Reagan did nationally, here in Massachusetts, we kind of, tend more towards liking big government and helping people. But I've thought that there's quite a bit of concerns about the Democratic Party. And I know that speaking to some of the journalists who reported on the debate, nobody really wanted to talk about poverty. I called a lot of them to task. All they wanted to talk about were casinos and the hot topic of the day. So I was just kind of wondering why is it here in Massachusetts, too, when I talk about poverty, people just kind of roll their eyes?
Well, I don't have an easy answer for that, but a couple of observations. One is that the state Massachusetts faces a long-term fiscal squeeze, even in an economic recovery. I won't get into why that's the case. But here we are in economic recovery. We had a budget deficit when Charlie Baker came into office and a big gap facing him and the legislature for the next year's budget. So we're in a long-term difficult period, and so that means there is less opportunity to try to fund important needs. So that's a sort of fiscal point. I think there's a broad political point as well, and that is that the reluctance to raise taxes that we've touched on here across the country has also impacted Massachusetts, even though we're a very blue state, obviously more progressive in most respects than many other states, and all to the good. But we've still been impacted by by this sort of national debate and my argument, the fracturing of the national consensus. And in addition, I should say, and this is where I'm talking earlier, it becomes paradoxical. Individuals, yes, we have an economic recovery here in Boston, but not the rest of the state. Many individuals are either unemployed or semi-employed, and they are not, they're feeling that it's very difficult. They don't want to see any additional taxes. And so I think the politics here underlying it has been further complicated by the fact that we haven't seen for many people, in essence what we're talking about tonight, the economic recovery in their own homes and their own lives. And so this is what I touched on earlier. The paradox is, on the one hand, we haven't seen that, but they're, okay, that's not good. But the other is then we don't have the political will to try to address the larger issues because people are not feeling as charitable because they're trying to make ends meet. So we're in this kind of circle. I think some of all of that is at play in Massachusetts. It's a very complicated question.
And I think it comes back to the point that I tried to make earlier about this sort of paradox that as inequality increases, it shapes political norms and political attention in such a way that we devote less attention to it. That in fact, we see far fewer anti-poverty initiatives in state legislatures than we did 10 years ago, even though they're more needed. And part of that has to do with, in a sense, what the earlier questioner identified via Citizens United as, somewhat a sort of corruption of the political system. But I think more importantly, it rests on the sort of basic dynamic of inequality as a political problem. It simply becomes, we see it as these forces that are shaping our world, that we can't do anything about it, and people are always going to fall through the cracks, and your attention is drawn to a narrower and narrower range of solutions.
Thank you.
We have the final two questions. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Linda Masuris, and I'm an educator. And we haven't talked about the role of the education system in all this tonight. As an educator, I worry about the fact that I think the responsibility for wage stagnation in this country since 1980 has been pushed too hard on our shoulders, on the shoulders of education. If education did a better job of educating people, we wouldn't have such wage stagnation. On the other hand, I also feel, as an educator who has worked in a great diversity of settings and different kinds of institutions, from elementary education to working with graduate students at top universities, I also feel that there is a fundamental problem in our country, an educational cultural problem that has helped feed the anger that has pushed the country to the right. And so I'm very torn. I wonder about the role of education in all this. I wonder what the two of you have to say about it.
Colin?
It's an interesting question. I think you put your finger on in many respects, a sort of dilemma. Obviously, I think public education as a collective good is tremendously important. I think the United States is and always has been derelict in sustaining public education on the back of local resources, which is very unusual among affluent democracies. And so you rely very much on local property taxes, and so schools in poor neighborhoods get poorer, the neighborhoods get poorer, and the schools get poorer, and you're in a very difficult cycle. Most states backfill that aid to some degree, but they do it reluctantly. But the second point, which I think is just as interesting and does not contradict the first, is that educating our kids for a more technologically complex, more demanding world is not the answer. The fact is that of the top 10 growing occupations in this country, one of them, nursing, pays more than the median wage. All of our job growth is in low-wage occupations. We don't see, and where there is high demand for workers, we don't see that demand bidding up wages, which suggests to me that it's not education, it's not the lack of skills that is shaping the fortunes of working families in the United States, but it's the collapse of the sort of bargaining power that you have in any job of any educational attainment that I think is the key. I mean, one classic example of that, which, I hate to sound self-interested, but look at the collapse of the labor market in higher education and the reliance on low-paid adjuncts in most, particularly public universities and small liberal art colleges. These are people of, very high educational attainment that are, maybe earning $17,000 or $24,000 a year.
I'd make one broad observation that my experience is that in terms of the question about blame, we all understand education's important and in its own right, and for living a full life, though there are different kinds of education. But I think so we accept that premise broadly, but I agree with Colin, we don't really peel back the layers of that and really understand, okay, what do we mean by education? And then we flip it and we blame it when things don't work out, we often blame educators. They're not educating people to the right career tasks or this or that, or they're just not good educators. And of course, lots of times that may be the case, but I think in some respects it's the most it's a value that we all hold, but one of the most widely sort of misunderstood aspects of our society.
Hi, I'm Heather Remoff from Arlington, and I find it difficult to talk about inequality without addressing the issue of monopoly and rent-seeking behavior. I see those two at absolute heart of the growth in inequality. The great fortunes, starting with the robber barons, had their roots in monopolies of naturally occurring resources. I think that's still true. The finance, insurance, and real estate industries are all characterized by rent-seeking behavior, and they just happen to have the largest investment in lobbyists. So my question to you, and you may not accept that rent-seeking behavior is very instrumental in the growth in inequality, but I think that it is. And if you accept that it is, how do we address the issue of lobbyists and the political aspect of those who benefited from that kind of behavior are empowered to put policies in place that protect their own rent-seeking behavior? If you could just address that. I'm going to sit down, but thank you very much.
Good. I mean, I think the best example of this kind of behavior is the trajectory of executive compensation. And there you have a sort of a classic example in which it's clearly not linked to the skill of the individuals. I mean, the defense of the runaway of the 1% is often, well, are you going to, begrudge LeBron James his millions because he has an exceptional talent, or Steve Jobs, or, the author of the Harry Potter books? But in fact, in most of in those cases are the rarities. Most of what we see is exactly as you described, rent-seeking behavior, in which executive compensation is now mostly set by compensation boards, which are populated by other executives, and so you have this sort of bidding up, regardless of firm performance. And it's a difficult situation to address, but it was certainly true in the 1950s and 1960s that we had more robust norms in corporate governance as to what executives earned, that we had more robust forms of shareholder governance that could put limits on that. And, in fact, there's tremendous amount of room for securities regulation to accomplish that, and it simply refuses to do so. So I think you're exactly right in terms of, I always want to be careful when we talk about inequality. We're talking about, in some respects, those falling through the bottom and those shooting through the top. And the rent seeking is the top end inequality that it helps to explain. And I think you're exactly right. It's important to move the spotlight from the notion that these are people of exceptional talent and initiative to, particularly if we recognize that most of those high incomes are in speculative finance, to the what you characterize correctly as, I think, rent-seeking behavior.
We are at the end of our time. I'd like to thank all of you for your questions and discussion. It's been very, very interesting discussion, and particularly I want to thank Colin Gordon for being here tonight and for sharing your expertise. Thank you so much, Colin.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
We are not afraid to say that this is about blackness, right? Okay. That this is and we believe that in fighting for blackness, it will lead to freedom writ large. That our struggle is a struggle that once we win will allow other wins, right? But we are not afraid to say this is about blackness, right? And we can stand in that.